Yeah, yeah. Well, this is, and let's,
All right, let me start. All right, first of all, I want to welcome everybody today to the Noisy Reality edition on September 28th. We're very pleased to have Timothy Ryback here today. Timothy is a historian and director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in The Hague. He previously served as a Deputy Secretary General of the Académie Diplomatique Internationale in Paris and was the Director and Vice President of the Salzburg Global Seminar. Prior to this, he was in Cambridge, Massachusetts at Harvard, I guess working for years teaching, correct, Timothy? And doing your doctorate.
absolutely, yes.
And he also has contributed mightily to our understanding about history in general. He's participated in articles in the Atlantic Monthly, the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. And I wanted to just share with the audience here some of the remarkable works that he has done over the years before we get into the actual discussion today, which is going to be a whole variety of these issues. Now, this book I remember looking at
It's
years ago,
going way back.
Rock Around the Bloc, and this is a history of rock and roll in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And for all of us, I mean, we're all rock and roll types here. So that was a really interesting contribution to something because I remember the first time I ever met somebody from Russia who was lecturing me about the Beatles. That was quite a revelation. Then he did The Last Survivor, Legacies of Dachau. Many years ago, I spent a year with veterans of the different divisions, but particularly the 45th Division, who went into Dachau that day to liberate it. And so that's something that always sticks with me. And then this book I recommend highly, Hitler's Private Library. We just were chatting about this. This is a look at Hitler was a voracious reader. He would throw Eva Braun out of sessions when he was reading. He'd get very angry. Get the hell out of here, he'd say to her. And but it's a really interesting look at his intellectual mind. This book, Hitler's Private Library, and I highly recommend it. Then, of course, he did a book on Hitler's first victims, which I also found very interesting to look at. And we're talking today about Takeover. Now, Takeover basically covers the period from the spring of 1932 until late January 1933, when Hitler is appointed chancellor. And it's a really interesting look. It's a look at contingency and how nothing's predictable in history. But before I start with that, let me just first ask you, we were talking a little bit about the comparisons today. I don't know if you've been interviewed lately about how far we're into this, but we're seeing newspaper reports today about Trump is meeting with all the generals. He's bringing all the generals from around the world, and he's bringing them to have a meeting where supposedly Hexas was there, and now he's coming. And so the first thing one thinks about is, my God, like, what's this like? Because when we're thinking about these analogies of history, when Hitler assumes power in January, a couple of days later, he brings in the Wehrmacht. He brings in the Reichswehr generals and says, look, I got you covered, guys. We're going to rearm. And, so we don't know what he's going to do. But then he's talking about sending troops to Portland, Oregon. Um, and all of us are quite aware of the issues of posse comitatus, the question of emergency powers. As far as I'm concerned, he's already passed an enabling act, which we can get into later. Most of us here are quite aware of what that is. But what now? We now have 6 months of him in power. So, what do you see is comparable to what happened in terms of the rise of fascism, not only in Germany and Italy, but elsewhere in the world? What can we see that we can draw as analogies, or are those analogies inappropriate?
Well, I think, well, thank you for having me on the show, Jim. Reminding me of some books from way back in my own history. But yeah, history, as we all know, does not repeat itself. We can look at resonances, but I think there are some unique dimensions to, National Socialist Germany, Hitler in particular, that will never repeat themselves, can never repeat themselves. First and foremost, the Holocaust. There is a look at sort of looking at equivalencies. There's talk about Stalin's agricultural policy in the Ukraine and the fact that more Ukrainians were killed by Stalin than Jews were killed by Hitler, and on and on. One looks for these comparisons. Um, I was talking to a German diplomat about this once, and he said, yes, yes, yes. But he said, keep in mind, we Germans were the only ones who put numbers on the risks of their victims. Um, and I, so, I, and the point being, you know, are there resonances with the past? Yes, but are we headed toward the Fourth Reich? No. America will have its own evolution in dealing with these issues. Is there a conservative resurgence in America, or I don't even know if it's a resurgence, but is there a conservative move in that direction? Yes. Is it troubling to some people? Yes. The question is, to what degree do the constitutional guardrails, will they hold themselves in place? Um, Let me mention, since you mentioned Cambridge, Massachusetts, yes, I did my doctoral work there, but I was teaching in a course in the late 1980s called Weimar and Nazi Culture. And I was an apologist for the Weimar Republic at the time. And what I used to tell the students was, look, you have to understand that, the Germans in the Weimar Republic only had, you know, 13, 14 years of experience with democracy. I said the United States has had at that time more than 200 years. Um, and we have over 10 generations imbued with democratic values. So you have to understand. And in some ways, that does sound very naive because I would not have thought that America would have moved as far in the direction that it has. Um, but there we are with it. And I guess coming back to the Weimar thing, there's a wonderful statement I believe was attributed to Peter Gay, the great Weimar
Yeah, yeah.
historian, from Yale. But originally his name was Peter Fröhlich, which in German means gay. But when he came to Ellis Island, he changed it to gay. In any event, I believe he'd once said that the Weimar Republic died twice. It was murdered and it committed suicide. And I think, it's a really interesting way to look at it, especially in a democracy, that you can have someone who is out to put an authoritarian stamp on a nation, on a political system. But there's also the other side to it. In a democracy ruled by the people, to what degree are the people themselves responsible? And I think Weimar, in that sense, you know, um, is a more complex picture. There's more going on there than we often think. And going back to America, I would say, what we're clearly seeing is a rise of conservatism in the United States. And, to what degree that's worrisome, to what degree is that simply an evolution of American values? I don't know.
All
We
right.
historians we look back, we don't look forward.
Okay. Well, we now one thing looking backwards is that when one looks at the way the deportation issue is being used, the immigration issue is being used, one can cherry pick all these different comments of Hitler about the question of Jews, and I'll just cherry pick one right here that he said a speech in 1929. Our blood is being poisoned and bastardized. We are tolerating those who create our social problems and halt our nation. Removal of Jews is a precondition for a national resurgence. Now, we've seen these kind of issues not necessarily being directed against Jews, but being directed against, quote, illegal, undocumented people of all types. And we've been watching as Americans these horrific images of people being torn from their families. There was just an issue of one in New York. Some woman just had her husband just stripped from her, and then the guy just jumps on her and throws her to the ground. We're going to see a lot worse than that. Now, um, and people are proud of that. I mean, I sit there and go into certain conservative news sites and troll them deliberately to argue with them. And they're proud of that. They take great pride that they're deporting all these people. So to me, those analogies are strong. Now, I wanted to get into the substance of your book, Takeover, and we can get back to analogies because we're obviously going to do that. Unfortunately, we're here living in the States, so we're seeing this all the time going on. Uh, I think it's important for you to explain a little bit about the topology politically of what's going on in the summer of 1932. What are these parties? What is their strengths and weaknesses? So if you could sort of run through, because we'll get to the personalities, but what is the center party? What is the party, the DNVP? What is, the SPD, the KPD? Give us a sense of that picture that we have, because this is what significantly begins to change as a result of the Depression, the mobilization, the political strikes, and everything else. And, because it gets complicated, it's the way you describe it in your book, it's sort of like a spy story, a thriller, like, okay, what's next? Hitler's doing this, Hitler's doing that. But what's the political basis of all this so we can understand that better?
Okay, well, you mentioned the summer of 1932. In order to understand the summer of 1932, you have to understand November of 1929. And you mentioned that, the Depression, the market crash, and one cannot underestimate the impact that that had on, the German economy and the German society at that point. There was mass unemployment. There were 6 million people, workers unemployed. I don't know, I'm not a statistician, but we're talking about what, 25% of the workforce is unemployed. There is, and I think it really, who was it in the Clinton administration said it's the economy, stupid. And it really was the economy. If you look at, and going to the summer of
James
1920,
Carville. James Carville said that.
James Carville, thank you. Yeah. And it was when you look at the summer of 1932, the reason that matters is because the National Socialists in the July Reichstag elections, they get 37% of the vote, which is stunning because in 1930 they had like 12 seats in a 600-seat legislative body. They were completely marginal. I mean, you had 12 guys in brown shirts sitting in a room filled with 600 others who were opposed to them. The crash comes, and in the September 1930, this is when you crash of 29, then September of 1930, they have new elections, and suddenly the National Socialists have, what, 107 seats, 110 seats, I don't know the exact number, in the Reichstag. So they practically increased their number tenfold. Then come along that 1932 election, and they double that number again. And we're talking about a parliamentary system, and this is just to paint where we are in the summer of 1932. So the National Socialists have 37% of the vote in a multi-party system. When you look at the ballots there can be as many as 30 parties on the ballot that people are voting for. But the ones that you mentioned specifically are important. The next largest party are the Social Democrats, which had been the largest party for the previous couple of years, the largest party followed by the communists, and then followed by, so you had sort of, in terms of the political constellation, you had this 37% being dominated by this hard right party. You then had these leftist to extreme leftist parties, and that then leaves you kind of with the center parties. You mentioned this, not the scrabble of other parties, but I think the major party in the center was called the Center Party, which kind of represented conservative centrist values, but committed to democracy. And I guess the question, what's important to look at here, and you also mentioned the German National Party, which tilted also it was a hard right party, anti-democratic. You know, and I think the important thing to distinguish with all of these parties at the time is which parties were committed to the constitutional republic, the Weimar Republic, committed to democracy. The Social Democrats were committed to the project of the Republic. The Center Party was committed to the Republic, conservative, but committed to the democratic system. The Bavarian People's Party, which was part of the centrist coalition, was also conservative, but once again committed to the Republic. What you had on the two extremes were the communists who were against they wanted a Bolshevik revolution.
Right,
They wanted a dictatorship of the proletariat.
right,
And you had the National Socialists combined with this, conservative led by Hugenberg, as a much smaller percentage, but a group of also hard right people. So you had on the two extremes of the political spectrum, you had these parties that were out to destroy the democratic system. You had the center trying to be held together, but once again, the center party conservative were not going to ally with the Social Democrats.
all
So
right.
even the center ended up being fractured.
Now,
That's where we were. And let me just add one other thing here. When Hitler, traditionally in the Weimar Republic, the largest party was then invited to form a coalition government, and whoever headed the number one party basically got to appoint the chancellor. There was a lot of haggling back and forth, but so Hitler, when they get 37%, Hitler goes in to see Hindenburg, who's the president, and the president decide, the president is the head of state. The chancellor is head of government. Hitler goes into Hindenburg and he says, I've got 30%, 37% of the vote. I want complete control. He wanted a purely National Socialist cabinet. And Hindenburg said, well, you've only got 37%. 51, come back with 51%, I'll give it to you. Well, he actually didn't say it. What he said was, um, he said, you only have 37%. I would never appoint you chancellor for the sake of God, my
right,
conscience, and the country. And he
right,
just basically booted Hitler
right,
out.
right.
Listen to Hitler's calculation, though. Hitler came back
Oh,
and
yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, tell us that.
these were discussions he had afterwards. And this is what you have
But
to,
doesn't
as
he go
much
to
as,
court? Doesn't he go to
well,
court to prove that he
well,
should be president, to be
Oh,
chancellor?
oh, oh, no, yeah, actually no. Hitler in the spring, Hitler had run for president. He'd lost by 6 million votes, but he sued in court to have the election results overturned, talking about irregularities by state
I
officials
must
and
admit that's a resonance, by the way.
yeah, there is, yeah, and there's a, but he got thrown out of court. I mean, the judge basically just ruled and said, 6 million votes. Sorry, not enough margin for error and booted him out. But listen to Hitler's calculation, which is the interesting one. Hitler said 37% is 75% of 51%. So if you
Ah,
control the relative majority of the absolute majority, you control it. And basically, Hitler constantly talked to his base. I mean, he was only worried about his base voters because he knew, and his base was actually smaller than 37%. It was probably realistically around 33% of people who were hardcore National Socialists were really with him. But he used basically that 37% to cudgel or crush opposition and ultimately fought his way to power using that. But the National Socialists were people, as much as they hated democracy, they really understood how the system functioned. Um, so anyway, but and that calculation, and the interesting thing is Hitler vowed to get 51% through his entire political career. And he never got it. Even in the famous March 33 election, he only came away with 44% of the vote. Um,
All right. Now,
so
before,
anyway, so I think, a kind of understanding those dynamics are important,
all right.
especially in the context of a parliamentarian system where a smaller percentage can be leveraged, against the others.
All right. Now, you have a great quote in your book on the writings of Hitler, which I just got a big kick out of. This is one of the founders of the National Socialist Party, Dietrich Eckart. And he supposedly said, "We need someone to lead us who's used to the sound of a machine gun, someone who can scare the shit out of people. I don't need an officer. The common people have lost all respect for them. The best would be a worker who knows how to talk. He doesn't need to know much. Politics is the stupidest profession on earth." Eckert claimed that any farmer's wife in Munich knew as much about any political leader. Give me a vain monkey who can give the Reds their due and won't run away as soon as someone swings a chair leg at him. I would take him any day over a dozen educated professors who wet their pants and sit there trailing with their facts. He has to be a bachelor, then we'll get the women. And Eckhart, of course, takes an Ibsen play and does a nationalist play on Peer Gynt, a sort of so I just want to. It really struck me these kind of intellectual influences. Then you get into someone like Otto Diekel. Let me just first finish this. Um, that is another person who is intellectually influencing him. You have Henry Ford. You describe how he's influenced by the International Jew that Henry Ford comes out with. Um, you have Anton Drexler, who also becomes an ideologue for the Nazis later. And then what I found fascinating, which a lot of people lately have paid more attention to, is this whole question of Americans influencing them. Oh, yes, and Ernst Jünger, the influence of Mein Kampf. Ernst Jünger, of course, writes memorable memoirs of his frontline service, completely in contradiction to the work of Erich Maria Remarque, who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front. And then you have just going through some of these others. Now, a lot of people are more familiar with this when they're looking at examinations of American attitudes towards racial supremacy. But Lothrop Stoddard, who writes The Rising Tide of Color, The Threat Against White World Supremacy. But my favorite is Guy Madison Grant, who influences Hitler tremendously when his book is translated in 1925 into German. And this is a book that actually influences American immigration policy. Talk about those ideas and how they're impacting the Nazi ideology and particularly Hitler personally.
Okay, let's go back to Dietrich Eckart because I think, to really understand Hitler, to understand the entire National Socialist movement, you really need to understand Eckhart. If you gave that wonderful quote, which I use, but if you'll notice, I use the word allegedly. That
Ah,
is a quote attributed to Eckhart. It may have been, but it also could have been, constructed afterwards. But there is no question about Dietrich Eckhart's influence on Hitler. He bought Hitler his first trench coat. The first play Hitler ever saw in Berlin was this Eckhart adaptation of Peer Gynt for the stage. But the most important thing, and there's no allegedly here, this is true, is the impact of Dietrich Eckart's anti-Semitism in shaping Hitler's own attitude toward the Jews. I mean, he was virulently, this is Eckhart, anti-Semitic, and helped make that part of the National Socialist agenda. So I'm glad you mentioned him because, in fact, his Eckhart doesn't get written about as much as it should because a lot of things are missing. There's an odd kind of movement of documents that should be in archives accessible to scholars. In fact, Dietrich Eckart's entire personal archive is in private hands.
Oh,
I
wow.
had I had access to seeing this, but what you see there are receipts where he was basically financing the early National Socialist movement. Eckhart, because of his plays, was a very wealthy man, was a well-to-do man, but was financing a lot of this. Also, as I say, helping shape the party's ideological thinking, but Hitler's in particular. I'm going to, this is an aside, but I think an important one because we were talking about the elections. I've read every Hitler speech from August 1932 until, January 30th, 1933. It's not reading I would recommend for anyone. But if the word Jew or Jewish conspiracy or Jewish influence comes up 10 times. I doubt it.
Interesting.
It was going back to James Carville, it was the economy, stupid. And the interesting thing is to the degree that Hitler dialed down his anti-Semitism in advance of the election, that was not part of his platform. And you didn't hear it in his speeches. Now, the other, the people on the side, the Streichers and the Goebbels and the Hans Franks were preaching the anti-Semitism, but that was not part of Hitler's rhetoric when he was going into towns and when he was campaigning. Um,
Interesting.
but
Interesting.
going back to this constellation of people you had, the other thing I would mention is actually Madison Grant is very important. We know Hitler's personal copy of the translation of the passing of the great, yeah, oh yeah, Untergang der Rosenrasse. Hitler had a copy of that. You can see it reflected in the writings in Mein Kampf. You can hear echoes of it there. Hitler allegedly said that this book was, Madison Grant was his Bible. Once again, this may be apocryphal or not. I think Madison Grant himself said that, claimed to have a letter from Hitler stating this. I've done a bit of digging around. No one's produced that letter, so I don't know, to what degree it's there. But the impact of American eugenics on immigration policies, on attitude toward race, absolutely derive from that. And the interesting thing is, this copy of The Passing of the Great Race is in the Library of Congress in a collection euphemistically called the Third Reich Collection. It's actually, there are 1,200 books that are from Hitler's private library. 1,000 of them are meaningless, but there are, 200 that are of interest, and I think 20 to 30 that are of great interest, many with marginalia. But in some of the unprocessed materials, there are also California, I think it's either eugenics laws.
Right.
There are California laws that are sitting in this collection of materials that found their way over. So yes, the American thinking on this, and this has been several scholars have written extensively on this, was part of that.
Right.
Was
And
part
and
of
the
that
thing the thing
thinking.
about and the thing about Madison Grant has an impact on the debates about the immigration laws in 1924. But I also found this entertaining because you discussed the actual sales of Mein Kampf, which not necessarily was the bestseller in 1927. And of course that changes very dramatically later. But I wanted just to, just illustrate some of the interesting effects because, you have Hans Gunther with his work, his racial topologies, including Jews in that, and then Paul de la Garde, who's one of the most notable uh, biblical scholars of the 19th century. And then comes out with and actually the source of the idea of sending Jews to Madagascar comes from Paul Lagarde. Um,
And if you could park on that for 1 second, because
sure.
there is Hitler's personal copy of that of Deutsche Schriften is also in the Library of Congress, and there is extensive marginalia there, in particular on passages related to the Jews. Now, I'm cautious to say this is Hitler's, handwriting in there. It's simply markings. It corresponds to the type of markings that we know are markings by Hitler in books, but it is the Deutsche Schriften. I think there are close to 100 pages with various passages that are marked, and it is an interesting book to mention.
Now
Sorry, and then you had.
you also have an entertaining thing here of Leni Riefenstahl, where Leni Riefenstahl is offered because Hitler has seen Blau Nicht, the great film that she did. She's a great mountaineer, and she is offered the chance to rake all his propaganda movies. He says, "The hell with it, I'm not going to do that." And then she decides to send him a first edition of Johann Fichte, which I found highly entertaining because here, of course, Johann Fichte is one of the great propagandists of the War of Liberation against Napoleon. Um, so it just is quite interesting to see these impacts on Hitler. But what was very interesting was when you discovered that most of what he had a lot of military history, which doesn't surprise me, but he also had a lot of occult books, which you talk about. Just to talk a little bit about that before we move into the elections of summer 32.
Okay, well, let me first go back to since we're talking about Fichte, Schopenhauer is also referenced there as a lot. Allegedly, Hitler carried the double volume of Die Welt des Willen Vorstellung with him in the trenches of World War One. I,
You found that
once
dubious,
again,
if I recall.
pretty dubious
Yeah.
because when you see in letters where he's writing Schopenhauer, he can't even spell the guy's name right. So, one has to be cautious with this. I don't think Hitler sat and read Fichte. I do think that he read digests of these works that were kind of filtered through, be it an anti-Semitic or a hyper nationalistic chauvinistic lens, you can have that. But as Hitler actually sitting and reading these, I don't think he had the patience or even the intellectual capacity. And I'm not saying the guy wasn't smart, but I don't think he had a mind that was trained to actually comprehend philosophy. So
Now, the
that.
occult issue is fascinating. Could you
Yeah.
go into that?
Yeah, the occult one is really interesting. And this is when I first started the research on this book. I had going back to the Clinton administration, I actually had was doing some research and found out that Harry Truman had been given Hitler's cufflinks. And after the war, that had been taken out of the bunker. And I said, wow, if the president had been given them, maybe they're still around the White House. And this was in the second Clinton term when, Clinton was in the White House, but the Congress was controlled by the Republicans. And I wrote to someone I knew in the Clinton White House, said, could you look around and see if you could find Adolf Hitler's cufflinks there? And, he sent this was in the days of fax. He sent a fax back to me and said, well, had a look, no Hitler cufflinks, but he says, you might want to look at Congress because they've got his books. And I said, what? And I went over and yeah, by God, in the other euphemistic title, Third Reich collection, they have 1,200 books. The earliest one being, now this is a book that we know Hitler carried with him in World War One. It was an architectural guidebook to Berlin. Um, and well, there it is, the Max Osborn, who is one of the great um, architectural critics, cultural critics of the day, also happened to be Jewish. And Max Osborn was on the list of books to be burned in May of 33 when they were burning them. Well, Hitler had this in his own library. But it's interesting because, Hitler has actually written his name on the inside and dated it. And this is where Hitler's interest was at the time. But going to the occult issue, Jim, what struck me was there was the number of books on religious, spiritual, and occult issues that I found in the Library of Congress collect in the rare book collection. And then there's another cache of about 100 books that were taken from Hitler's bunker that are now at Brown University. And so I went up to Brown and I was looking through those, and once again was struck by the number of books with titles like this and dealing with this, and many of them with marginalia. And
I
so began exploring this. Um, at the time, this was in the early 2000s, this Traudl Junge was still alive. And Traudl Junge, um, she wrote this, oh, there you have her. Great. Okay. She was Hitler's private secretary for the last 18 months of his life, of his life. She wrote a Jim, I saw you signaling. Are we
No, that's
okay?
all right. It's some
Oh, okay,
hey,
okay, yeah. And in any event, she was with him every day for the last, 18 months of Hitler's life. And she did confirm that he read a book practically every night. He would read a book because he would show up for breakfast. He was alienated from his military staff at that time, so he would have breakfast with her, and she would be getting every morning these book reviews about what he had read the previous night.
ah,
And I showed her some of the marginalia. I showed her these titles, and she said, absolutely, he was preoccupied with this notion of a possible higher power, what we know, what he
ah,
called Vorsehung or providence. And she said she did not, to her mind, he did not believe that there was some, gray bearded, God sitting on a cloud, handing out dictates, but that he did believe there was a broader structure to this universe that shaped things that he was part of. And after she said this, she paused for a second and she said, but how can anyone ever know what another person really believes or doesn't? And I thought that was an important qualifier. I mean, Hitler was clearly a hardball politician. He was a ruthless politician. He was a megalomaniacal military leader. Everything about him was there. But I do think, in looking at it, that his preoccupation with some higher force, some higher power, some destiny, his Vorsehung, did play a role in all of this.
yeah. Well, one thing you quote here is this comment by Hitler: "The worst blow ever suffered by mankind is Christianity. Bolshevism is the illegitimate son of Christianity. Both are an outgrowth of the Jew." And you precede that with looking at the Austrian bishop, Catholic bishop, Aloy Hudal, who later is involved in organizing the rat lines to allow the German war criminals to escape to Spain, Middle East, Latin America, etc. and who's trying to create a bridge and a gap between the Catholics and sort of fusions of Catholic and Nazi ideology, which I found fascinating to see that in there. And then, of course, we have Karl May, who we're very familiar with. Um, him giving out Karl May novels to generals in 1944 to read to stiffen them up to fight against the Soviets. And finally, you have, of course, something that is well known to most of us. He's sitting there waiting for the miracle of Frederick the Great. He's waiting for the Empress of Russia to die and the whole coalition collapse. And he's reading Thomas Carlyle, Frederick the Second of Prussia, the multi-volume history done by Carlyle. Just to conclude this, so just give me your take on those influences on him intellectually.
Well, so this doesn't run too long. Let's focus on Carlyle specifically because we do know this is Hitler was reading Carlyle in the bunker at the end of the war. Goebbels, even in his diary, talks about bringing a copy of Carlyle over to him. So we know he was preoccupied by it. And word has it when there was a moment when Frederick the Great, it looked as though things were over. He was going to commit suicide, and Catherine the Great suddenly dies, and Prussia is saved. When Hitler, this is one of the bunker stories, to what degree it's apocryphal or not, or to what degree Hitler actually believed it, or to what degree it was played into it. But Hitler did when Roosevelt died, allegedly Hitler said, this is the miracle of Brandenburg that's going to save me, and waited for things to shift, for alliances to change. He didn't expect a miracle, but he wondered if there would be a reconfiguration of alliances that would allow the Hitler and the Nazis to buy time, which clearly didn't play out. A week later, Hitler commits suicide and it's over.
So let's get back to the summer of 32, because I think it's important what we just went through to just get some ideas about Hitler's ideology, which some of us may not be familiar with. I know a lot of us here are pretty well informed about Hitler, but there's always new things to learn about Adolf. Uh, Now let's talk about the players that we're talking about in the summer of 32. And let's first talk about Paul Hindenburg and his son Oscar, who's actually sympathetic to Hitler. So, what role is and Hindenburg is rejecting Hitler, as you mentioned earlier in that meeting in the summer of 32. But explain the role of Hindenburg in all this.
Well, hey, you see there, he's a bit, I don't know what year that picture is taken. That's but Hindenburg, keep in mind, he retired. He was a career military guy. He retired in the spring of 1914.
Ah,
His career was over. A war breaks out, and to serve his country, he re-enters the military, becomes the great field marshal, he in Ludendorff, the Battle of Tannenberg and all of this. And ultimately, okay, they lose the war, but Hindenburg then, um, as most leaders do when they're out of office, goes in and decides to write his memoir. So by the end of the war, by 1919, Hindenburg has retired a second time and is writing his memoirs. In 1925, there's a crisis, and they need a president to stabilize the country. Um, Hindenburg does not want to run for office, but is convinced for this because he's a monarchist at heart. He doesn't even believe in democracy, but for the sake of his country, he runs for election. He wins, he becomes president, elected to a 7-year term. Okay. So from 25 until 32. In the spring of 32, he decides his time is going to retire again. And the country is, and we need to keep in mind, there is the crash of 29. The country was gradually stabilizing, and it was slowly by 32, it was things were the crisis was still there, but things were looking better. They could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And what they wanted to do was to have Hindenburg serve another 2 years.
Hmm.
So in the Reichstag, a bill was put forward to extend the presidential term by 2 years. That required a two-thirds vote. Um, the National Socialists decided because Hitler wanted to run for president. What happened was the National Socialists voted against this bill, which then meant Hindenburg either had to go into retirement, which would allow Hitler to be elected president, or he had to run for another 7-year term. So Hindenburg, once again, for the sake of the country, and it was basically, he beat Hitler by 6 million votes, but it was essentially at the age of what, 83, 84, it was a death sentence in office. So he then enters into this final stretch. And so here you have this guy who, by the summer of 32, he has wearied of all of this, but is still committed to the democratic process and or to the Constitution. And someone once said that Hindenburg followed the Constitution the way a field officer read a military manual. I mean, if it says this, you do this. And Hindenburg's hope or job he wanted to get a legislative body in place that could have a chancellor with a majority vote that was conservative. I mean, he wanted something that tilted right, not to the left. And that's where he was in the summer of 32.
Okay. So now you have the defense minister, Kurt Schleicher, with his associate General Kurt von Hammerstein. And what's interesting about Kurt Schleicher is when you describe in your book, basically he's plotting all the time. His objective is to have the Sturmabteilung crush the KPD, crush the Social Democrats, and then he's going to use the Reichswehr to crush the Sturmabteilung. So explain, and then he sort of outfoxes himself at the end of this story, but explain what he's like, and then Hammerstein, who is replaced rather precipitously by Hindenburg uh, towards in January of 1933. But what's Schleicher all about?
Well, Schleicher was, Hindenburg trusted Schleicher. Schleicher was sort of the Hindenburg whisperer, but he was a military guy who, for him, it was politics was war by other means, and he was actually more comfortable playing games in politics. There's a New York Times bureau chief in Berlin at the time said if anything was going on in German politics that was seemed incomprehensible or obscured, it meant that Schleicher was behind it. And the guy, as you use the term fox, he was just manipulating the entire system. He had been in charge of military intelligence in the country. So his network of people in the country, he had ears everywhere in every political party and was able to manipulate the system. What ultimately happened was Hindenburg got tired of this and dismissed for complicated reasons, but basically ended up dismissing Schleicher, positioned himself. He got rid of Brüning, who had been chancellor, brought Papen in, and then Papen fell, and Schleicher then was in position to, although there you have Papen. That what was said about Papen, my favorite quote, I don't know if it was Hitler or who said it, but it was, he's this handsome aristocratic guy, and he said his head was used for carrying a top hat rather than brains. So he was, but in fact, Papen was was also played Hitler. I mean, what happened was Schleicher brought Papen down, and then Papen went behind the scenes and brought Schleicher down and brought Hitler in. Now we're up to January 32. But going back to the summer of 30 in January of 33, in the summer of 32, Schleicher has Hindenburg's ear and is really the ultimate power player on the political scene.
Okay. Now then you have someone like this, Alfred Hugenberg, who is, of course, obviously reminiscent of Rupert Murdoch or some mega mogul today, like Bezos um, or Zuckerberg, anybody like that. So to explain him, he's a multimedia magnate, and he's
Well, what
exerting
happened
himself
was
politically.
he actually worked for Krupp and he was a
Ah,
director there and made his money there. What happened was in like 1918, 1919, he realized that the press was controlled pretty much by liberal cosmopolitan thinkers, and most of the major newspapers tilted left. And Hugenberg had not had any media experience, decided to start buying up all of these newspapers to create a right-wing response to the sort of what he felt was the liberal press. Ended up controlling about 1,600 newspapers and was really, we hear about fake news. He was an amazing manipulator of fake news. At the time, they were called fabrications, Fabrikationen. But my favorite one of his was, and you read literally half-page articles in newspapers about this, that the German government, in order to service the war debts, the reparation payments under the Treaty of Versailles, were enslaving German teenagers and sending them off to French and British colonies in order to work off the German war debt. A complete invention. But you're reading this in the hard copies of his newspapers. So he was getting information out there, first of all, poisoning the public space with it. He also practiced something that he called the Katastrophenpolitik, which was, the politics of catastrophe. The idea was to get issues out there into the public space that would divide parties, that would divide communities, that would divide families. One of them was calling for, it was a public referendum calling for the abrogation of the Treaty of Versailles. And which a lot of Germans may agree with, but what he added to that was that any signatory to the Treaty of Versailles, any government official involved with the implementation of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles should be tried for treason and hanged. And this goes out as a public referendum. I mean, we know where that went, but his point was to sort of divide society.
right. You're
Like,
talking about how you wanted to divide it from within, sort of like what the Nazis were doing. Now, when we get to the events of January 1933, it's just one thing after the next. You have this meeting with von Papen, and this is a cartoon from the time of Hitler and von Papen caught in bed with each other on January 4th, 1933. Then you have other players we haven't talked about yet, the Stahlhelm coming into the mix, Theodor Duesterberg. Then we have another cartoon on January 16th of Schleicher being attacked from all directions. Um, it's fascinating to see how the caricatures in the German press were picking up on this. And then you have Schleicher pondering the next day on January 17th, is am I going to choose Hitler or Otto Strasser or Gregor Strasser, who we haven't mentioned yet, but I think we should in a moment. And then you have continuation of these events. On the 19th, the Social Democrats, this whole question of the big business financing Hitler, because one thing you argue about in your book is that Hitler's broke. The whole Nazi movement is broke, um, which is something not everybody tends to imagine. And then you have on January 19th, because they've concentrated so much effort in this off-season election in the tiny state of Lippe, they have this, basically the satirical procession of them seizing control of Lippe. Then you have Rosenberg, who becomes, Joachim von Ribbentrop, who becomes a foreign minister. He's meeting with Hitler and von Papen, trying to put them together. And then you have demonstrations occurring on the 22nd, but it all builds up, and it builds up to the events of January 28th, 29th, and 30th. You have, and what always surprises me is that when Schleicher is dismissed by Hindenburg, immediately his enemy Blomberg is put in to replace him, Werner von Blomberg, who will later be killed by Hitler during the Night of the Long Knives. Uh, but just, synopsize, and we'll start to take comments and questions. And you have the cabinet. That's the result of this on January 30th, 1933. And again, the resonance issue, the analogy issue, if I'm putting my social science hat on, there's all sorts of theories of the rise of National Socialism and fascism. We can certainly see the measures implemented after January 30th that do bear analogies to the time we're living in as Americans. But what do you what goes on in this situation with all these different people power playing back and forth, and leading to Hitler basically being chosen as a chancellor on January 30th?
Well, Jim, I think you did a brilliant job summarizes showing all the players, showing how we got there.
But it was
Uh,
fun putting it together.
well, I'll tell you, those some of your cartoons I'm going to ask for because some of those I hadn't seen. But let me just say, let me actually, if you want to have references, resonances with today, let me tell you this, and this is looking at the cartoons. Um, I saw, over the last several years, we've seen endless numbers of cartoons, about the current political situation. There were endless cartoons about Hitler. What Hitler said at one point, this was late in the autumn of 32 when he realized he was getting close to power. When things were looking serious, he said, you know, for the last 13 years, people have mocked and ridiculed me. No one is laughing now.
Oh yeah.
And after the 30th, and believe me, I've been reading these papers because I'm doing some work now, the cartoons disappear. Well, actually, because most of
They're
the
suppressed.
newspapers that were printing the cartoons disappeared. But the fact is, even, Vorwärts and some of these others that were really, producing these amazing cartoons, these wonderful cartoons, um, very pointed cartoons, but people stopped laughing. And I think if there's any resonance with one resonance I do feel is sort of, suddenly all of these cartoons have all these memes that have been out there are not as prevalent as they had been.
Right. Well, and what's interesting is that when you look at the measures that are thrown into place right afterwards, and again, the Jews are the target, the main target, as are the left, the socialists, the communists, etc. Uh, but again, you know, people sitting here in the United States, these people get upset if people decide to make analogies and call them fascists and Nazis. Well, if they weren't acting like that, people wouldn't be saying those kind of things. All right, let me bring in Alex. Go on, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for an excellent talk.
Oh, sorry, Alex. I just muted you again.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, yeah. Again, I was thank you, Dr. Ryback, for an excellent talk. First, let me ask: have you seen the recent documentary about Riefenstahl that just came out in the U.S.?
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay. So then I won't. There was, yeah, because there was some interesting stuff in there again about her. Well, how she kind of tried to spin things afterwards, but also again, some of the stuff that we now know about what she was doing, at the time. But so yeah, I'll ask.
I hope it showed her for what she was.
Yeah, of
Yeah, okay,
course.
good.
But
Okay,
also they had, interviews I'd never seen before of her, like on West German television, where she's. But also she had done some. an interview for, I don't forget which station, or or for a documentary, with these German guys, and you could see her. She's like in it. She's like, well, I mean, she clearly gets said to them, but she's like, oh, that was off the record. You can't, because again, she has said some pretty incriminating things, essentially, that kind of, well, show that she knew again, who this idea that, oh, I know what the Nazis were, and other, but or well, especially of course about the Holocaust, because I guess now it's been documented that when she was sent into Poland at the beginning of September 39, to like do an upcoming film about the war, essentially, and that she was president, for example, the massacre of Jews and and the whole thing again with her and the gypsies that got sent off to the concentration camp. But what I wanted to ask, since I guess you clearly do political history, I'm just wondering, because I'm thinking of your contemporary politics in Europe, and what do you think about the analogy to the AfD now? I mean, how would you situate them as a Nazi party, or what? Yeah, and whether you think they can use the same, now in Germany, use the same kind of tactics that Hitler did to assume power in the same way. Yeah.
It's a really good question, and I'll give it because I know we're running out of time, but I'll give a brief answer. I spent a fair amount of time in Berlin, and right before the election last year, one of the elections, I happened to I needed to go out to a small town outside of Berlin. This is in the sort of former East Germany territory. And you get out of the train, and it's one of these blighted, devastated areas, boarded up and everything. At the train station, when you got out, there was an AfD stand with
Oh,
young people there. The CDU was not present. The SPD was not present. The Greens were not present. They were the only party there. And my concern about the AfD, and I guess I'm very hopeful for the Germans, but I think there is good reason for concern, is once again a bit like the National Socialists, that they're talking not to the high ideals, but we're there for you. We're not worried about freedom and liberty. We're worried about inflation and employment. So I'd say, and they can beat a lot of those drums on the issue of immigration is an issue and is a problem. And I guess there is some concern for that, but I think their ability to find their way into the places where the other parties are not penetrating, the signal is we're there for you and we're listening to you. And these were
right.
not thugs standing behind the AfD thing. These were sort of young, well-dressed people. And you're going, wow, and frankly, I found that pretty scary because it's like, where's everybody
Well, yeah,
else?
again, what I found scary is this past election, which in North Westphalia, which I guess is an old SPD stronghold. It's basically the Ruhr. It's like the industrial center, and there they did so well. But the other question I want to ask is, I mean, I've done a bit of reading into the funding of the Nazis, which again, there's still a lot of questions on. So I just wonder um, if there's been more anything come out. But also, again, where do you stand on the idea of the essentially big business, essentially either being behind the Nazis, or, well, at least at the very end, again, essentially pushing Hitler forward as an alternative to the KPD and the socialist takeover of Germany. That uh, fascism was basically, again, there's this old political argument. Yeah, essentially, yeah, liberal Democrats will always choose fascists over socialists. So I'm curious what your thoughts
Okay.
on that. Yeah.
I'll keep this one short, but there is, you have to keep in mind the name of this party, which was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. So not only were they socialists, but they were a workers' party. And you had the odd outliers like Fritz Thyssen, who was supporting them. The vast majority of businessmen did not. There's this famous January 32 speech where Hitler goes and addresses the industrial club in Düsseldorf, the industry club. There are 600 people show up for it. Afterwards, Schacht circulates a letter among these leading industrialists and businessmen endorsing Hitler for chancellor, and not a single person signs up.
Okay.
So this is where industry was. He had certain silent backers. There was foreign money coming in, which is still maybe isn't all clarified. I assume Turner is the man on this. But what I find interesting is that when Schacht, after Hitler's appointed chancellor, 3 weeks later, Goering hosts a meeting basically invites 30 industrialists to this meeting. Everybody shows up who's anybody, including 4 executives from IG Farben, which was a creation of the Weimar Republic. Not a single National Socialist on the board of directors, committed to democracy and the Republic. And as we know, what IG Farben ended up producing,
Right.
for the system.
Right, because I just
So yeah,
heard
I
something
mean,
alleging the crops were
yeah,
somehow.
I'm, and I think, when you look at resonances, it is interesting. And actually, Krupp is the one who said, even after the war, when the Krupp family was on trial, they said, look, at the end of the day, our interest has to be in corporate profits. So I mean, this is with everything, and he says this. So, and it is the job of business to keep business
Right.
going. But anyway,
Right, right, and I should add, I should add, Alex, and both to you, Timothy. I watched debates between Turner and David Abraham when they had that big controversy over Abraham's book. I mean, he basically forced him out of the academy, and it was
yeah.
quite ugly to watch. Julian, go on, Julian.
Yeah, let me just start by saying that I'm amazed at how much you know, Jim. I didn't know you knew that much. Professor Ryback, I'm a professor at Concordia University. I'm in political science. And I thought I spent a lot of time having my students read, John Toland and Mein Kampf. But I've just bought your book because I now realize that my knowledge is extremely superficial. But as a political scientist, I'm not that interested in domestic politics. Having seen what Hitler read, can you help solve one of the big puzzles that I've seen from many different tangents? And that is, how did Hitler deal with the puzzle of how to start a war and keep the British from bringing in the Americans? Because I think I've seen from multiple tangents when Hitler was asked or approached, or there was even something in Toland's book where he's describing Hitler for a day, just pacing back and forth in his office on the final decision to provoke the English, and this sort of this and there were books by Lajos, the Hungarian, about the Nazis can't win, and by there's a German Jew whose name I just forgot, who coined the term Blitzkrieg, who also described that conundrum that was known even in World War I. So in your research, what would your estimate be about did Hitler solve the problem in his head? Did he never solve the problem? And for IR specialists, it seems to be the one big unknown, because we're not inside. We didn't get inside his head. And again, I bought your book because I didn't know. Shockingly, I didn't know someone actually went through his 26,000 book collection to find out what he was thinking. But I look forward to reading it.
Okay, well, first of all, it's wonderful. Thank you for the question. It's wonderful to hear John Toland's name brought up because I really think he did a sensational job with that history. He was a great storyteller, and most importantly, he interviewed people that no one else had interviewed. I mean,
Right.
Shire's book is great, and frankly, there are so many great biographies, but the Tolan one, he was going and interviewing people that we've
They're dead.
forgotten about it and has fallen off screen. I've been to the sound archives at the Library of Congress and have used John Toland's interviews
Ah,
because they're so fascinating. And what's unfortunate, and then I will get to the question, but there was, he interviewed a cousin of Hitler's who
ah.
had a lot of letters, family letters and family correspondence, and you hear him shuffling the papers as he's talking and reading excerpts from them. Um, I've done as much research as I can. I don't know where these papers ended up, but there are, personal letters of Hitler writing to family members that I think would be really insightful. In any event, to the question itself, I'm not a military historian, and I'm focusing, very much on the early part of the career. What I would say, two things. One is, it was clear from the outset, literally from Hitler's first weeks in office, that he wanted a war. And going back to our question of big business, one of the things that he talked about when he met with these businessmen was that they were going to rearm. And I think Hitler saw this as the only way of of reviving the German economy. He was very vague about his plans for his quote unquote 4-year plan. But I think at the end of the day, the way he was going to revive the way he revived it was through rearmament. And the way he tried to then pay for all of that was through war and conquest. So I think it was built into the system from the very beginning, whether he had to parse things about, who would get involved or not, or how he would do it. But I think with him, war was inevitable from the first weeks, from the first days, from the first weeks in office. The second thing was, and this is more of a personal thing, is that, his mother died of cancer. Hitler was very afraid of cancer, and Hitler really felt he needed to go to war by the age of 50. I mean, once again, that's more anecdotal, and you can get things to kind of line up to make that work. But in any event, no, I think war was part of the equation. Now, would he have preferred to have Brits on the German side? Yeah, and he always saw them as sort of the natural kind of Aryan allies to the project.
All right, Michael.
Sorry, may I do a quick follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
question.
I'll be sharp. First, yeah, Professor Ryback, if I had a choice between listening to a conversation with someone who knew Hitler or Hitler himself even, versus getting access to their library, I think, people lie to themselves. So if you do a verbal survey, you're going to get a lot less. I find that if you track marginalia, you get far more into the soul of an individual because they're writing to themselves at that time. And I have to say, a lot of us have defiled library books when we see outrageous, marginalia, and we add our own marginalia, and you end up with like Sun Tzu's multiple commentaries. Those are, of course, the best books, which is why it'd be nice if we went back to paper books and not these PDFs. But if I could ask just one last question, and forgive me for taking us to IR, but in my reading of Mein Kampf, it seemed that Hitler, the war that Hitler was fighting was some sort of bizarre microcosm of Austrian Germans trying not to be culturally influenced by Slavs going off in different self-determination directions. And then when he becomes the leader of Germany, he does things that are very parochial Austrian, which is, after he defeats France, he doesn't ask for Alsace-Lorraine. And the French Foreign Ministry says, listen, you're not an Austrian anymore, you're German, you have to do German things. So you have to ask France to give over the bits of real estate. So I'm wondering if Hitler is entrapped in some sort of bizarre Balkan schema. And I mean, the war he wanted was a war against Russia to stop influencing the Slovaks and the Czechs. And actually, he didn't think deeply about the Anglo-American relationship, which is ultimately his not only his downfall, but the downfall of both German conflicts.
Let me say yes. That's yeah, that's probably a long answer. I think your identification of Hitler as an Austrian or a Southern German and reflecting those interests rather than Prussian interests is really interesting and certainly worth thinking about. Oh, that's fascinating.
Thank you very much. I look forward to reading
Well,
your
the
book.
other thing I would like to add is when you mention about the marginalia don't lie, there's a wonderful essay by the German philosopher Walter
Yes.
Benjamin, and it's called Unpacking My Library. And I actually talk about it. I use that as sort of the moral frame
Right.
for my Hitler library book. But Benjamin says exactly that. He says, don't just wait till somebody's gone. And then if you really want to know who they are, look at their library, because libraries don't lie. Anyway.
I was
I,
laughing. I was
But
laughing when I
question,
hold on, Michael. Go on, Mike.
question.
Who's that?
that's the Colonel.
Yeah, where,
Yeah, well,
where did Hitler keep his library or his books?
He kept it in three locations. He kept a cache. His most precious books he kept at his apartment in Berlin, in Munich, in the Prinzregentenplatz. He kept another collection of books at the Berghof, up on the Obersalzberg. And some of those books are still floating around. And then he had another cache of books in the in his private collection in Berlin. And the surviving books we have, as I mentioned, there are about 100 at Brown University. There are 1,200 at the Library of Congress. A much larger collection is in Moscow that no one can get access to. But the Berghof collection and the Munich collection in particular were picked apart by American GIs coming in. After all the Hitler, when they came into the apartment, you took the really cool stuff, the dagger with the swastika or this is, and what was left over were the books. And so there are books scattered throughout the world, but in particular in the United States, that were taken both from the Berghof and Hitler's apartment. But
wow.
we do, as
Well,
I say,
the Berghof was destroyed. I've been there. I've gone through the ruins. So though that was, prompted the question. Uh,
there's
it's
actually a photograph of American congressmen visiting the ruins of the Berghof in summer of 1945. You watch them walk, as there's newsreel footage, you can watch them walking out with books from Hitler's library in their hands. So, um,
Too much.
okay. Well, all it is ruins today, and
yeah.
but people still go and walk through the ruins.
Well,
I
all
know
right.
that.
All right. Anyway, and I love that essay by Benjamin. That was very funny because for those of us who have big libraries, I said, "Oh, I got to go read that damn essay." Go on, Michael.
Yeah, hi. I have two questions, totally disparate questions. But the first one was, and this would be centered on it'd be answerable by the marginalia actually. But to what degree do you think? It seemed as if to me that Hitler didn't read most of these books. He scanned them. He just went through looking for selective things that would support his argument or confirm his beliefs or whatever. To what degree do you think that was the case, that most of these books, and you seem to allude to it at one point, that he didn't really read them, he just cherry picked and was very selective about what he was looking for. And the second question, which is totally different, is that there is a story, which may or may not be apocryphal, that somebody once asked Hitler what his real reason for for going against the Jews, what the real reason was. And basically, he said, was it because of, they're gangsters, they're communists, they're whatever. And Hitler said the real reason was that, supposedly, said that the real reason was that the Jews gave us the two concepts that are the enemies, the biggest threat to Teutonic nationalism, to Teutonic superiority. And he said, and those two concepts are that Oriental despot and his supposed son. So to what degree was this idea of this antipathy towards Jews and thusly Christianity as well, was it directly a power struggle between which, in other words, whether or not Germans or Germany or Teutonic nationalism would be, shall we say, the god, or Hitler himself, or this other god that people worship? So you can answer those questions in whatever order you want.
Christ.
And
Well,
those are the
actually, I'll
last
answer.
questions for today. Go
Okay,
on.
and I'll answer this one. It's basically use the term cherry picking. That's right. In Mein Kampf, Hitler's he devotes 2 or 3 pages to how to read a book. And what he says in there is it's fascinating. He says, if you simply read books to learn, you will become so confused that you'll not be able to make sense out of anything. He said, what you should do when you read, he says, it's like building a mosaic. You come with a preconceived notion and you read for those pieces that confirm what you already believe. So this was his philosophy with that.
Right.
I think I would also apply it to anti-Semitism. I think, Hitler had this deep anti-Semitism imbued in him. I would argue it did come from Dietrich Eckart. It also came from a general sense of anti-Semitism that existed in the culture. But what he did was to take those pieces that, once again, cherry picking anything that would confirm that. This relationship between, and especially Bolshevism and Christianity, and anti-Semitism come together. Dietrich Eckart wrote an essay. Well, it's not an essay. It's allegedly a conversation between Hitler and Eckart. It's sort of the master and the protege. Now, it's an invented dialogue by a playwright, but and I think it's, Eckhart sort of defining his influence, showing his influence on Hitler. But it's a really interesting discussion about that. Interesting, it's horrific, but it actually brings that together. Bolshevism, Judaism, Christianity are all of the same, and it all goes back to the monotheistic Judaic roots.
Right. And this is the essay that Timothy was talking about
There you
from
go.
Bolshevism,
Sure.
from Moses to Lenin. And it's quite interesting. This, listen, it was just absolutely fascinating. We could get you on and keep you here for another hour at least. So perhaps for another time, Timothy.
Okay.
But I want to thank you so much. Timothy Ryback is the author of Takeover: Hitler's Final Rise to Power. And before you go, just tell us a little bit about what the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation is all about.
We were basically founded by a South African justice who was the first chief prosecutor for the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague back in the 90s.
Goldstone?
Justice Goldstone, exactly, Richard Goldstone. And he said when he would go to Bosnia, he said he would always get when he'd sit down with someone, he would always get a 2-hour history lesson before they get discussed. And he said everyone always had a completely different history.
Wow.
And so he said, the courts can render justice on individuals, but he said there are deeper senses of injustice that need to be explored. And this is basically, the founding of our institution. And, we've worked in various places around the world. I will say, unfortunately, the world is not better for this. I wish, because we've worked in the Middle East, we've worked in Turkey, Armenia. I mean, we've worked in the Ukraine. So it hasn't worked. But anyway, I very much enjoy this. I especially enjoyed the questions and the comments, and I hope I answered some of them. Wonderful to hear John Toland's name brought up, because he's a really, it was history that was written in a day when it was
Oh yeah.
really
I,
great.
I interviewed John Toland 35 years ago.
No.
And yeah, oh yeah. And I probably have a tape of it too. But it was really terrific to listen to. A very close friend of mine was the first general counsel of Human Rights Watch, Jamira Rohn. So we used to talk about all this in the 1980s. She used to teach me about this kind of stuff. So it's really nice to see this work going, Timothy. I will send you the PowerPoints so you can use them. But thanks again. We'd love to have you another time. It was really first rate. And, this is a very important topic. And as you can see, as Americans, we're concerned about, what's going on here. We don't want to have a Hitler or a Mussolini kind of situation. And unfortunately, that seems to be what we're experiencing. All right. Well, thank you, Timothy.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
very much.
Thank
Okay.
you. Yes.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks, Professor.